Namani, hello everyone. My name is Kim Barbour and I'm delighted to welcome you today to the first session, the first webinar for the Diversifying Persona Studies Conference in 2021. As we begin, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout the continent on which the conference was organised and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples and to all First Nations peoples around the world. I'm here today on Kaurna land, for which sovereignty was never ceded. Today's webinar takes its focus, takes as its focus, personas on social media. It builds from a wonderful playlist of presentations that's currently online, and the panel is made up of Michael Humphreys, Jessica Hodgkiss, Travis Holland, Saira Ali, and Chris Moore. As far as the format goes, I'm going to start by asking each of the 5 panelists to introduce themselves in turn and to give a very short reminder of what their presentation was about. And from there, I've put together a number of questions, both about individual pieces of research and about the intersections between these pieces of research as well. And we'll kind of talk around them. However, for those of you in the webinar audience, and I see a few of you there, I really encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask questions either to individuals about their particular papers or to the group as a whole as the discussion continues. And I have wonderful Caitlin Adams here in tech support position who's going to be helping me keep track of those discussions as they go on. We are recording this session and we will be putting this up in hidden mode, the same as your presentations on YouTube in the same playlist, probably early to mid next week. So for those people who are watching this on YouTube, welcome to the replay. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll just, because it's awkward knowing who goes first on these things, I'm going to ask each of you on the panel, please, to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your work. And I'm going to start at the person who's in my top left, which is Travis. So Travis, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, Kim. Hi, everybody, fellow panelists and the people joining in the audience. My name is Travis Holland. I'm a lecturer in communication at Charles Sturt University. My paper looked at the Opportunity rover on Mars, and it's what I called collective persona. So the persona that was generated, the idea of opportunity that exists out there for people in the world. The Opportunity rover landed on Mars in 2014 and it expired in 2018. I've got those dates right now because I'm not going to look like much of an expert if not, but it on its expiration, the rover generated an outpouring of grief and emotion, and NASA set up a website where people could send postcards, as they called them, to Opportunity. And so I sampled from those postcards. There are over 30,000 of them. The time I did the sampling, I took about 2,000 of them and essentially did a content analysis to see how people were talking to Opportunity. Insofar as social media goes, it sits somewhere toward user-generated content, but not social networks, which is what I think most others on the panel have focused on. So that's an interesting intersection to think about. In recent years, we've got really caught up with social networks, and there are still other forms of user-generated content out there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Travis. And I think I'll move next to Saira, and with the proviso, of course, that I co-authored this paper with her, but she's here repping for the paper while I moderate. So Saira, if you can tell us a little bit about the work that we did together.
Kim and I looked at the 2 different perspectives of migrant persona, and our special focus was on 2020 because it was a special year. So the project was based on collaborative autoethnography, and which is a first step towards a larger project that we are looking to do towards migrant personas in Australia. So we identified the social media platforms that we wish to study, settling on basically 2 key platforms each for both of us. Twitter, we looked, both of us use Twitter, so we use that. And I also looked at Facebook and came at Instagram. And then we took some screenshots of the entire year from the 1st of January 2020 to 31st December 2020. And then we analyzed the data. And based on the data and the reflections that we, the coding that we did and the reflection that we did, we selected, we kind of identified 3 main strategies that we use for interacting with or connecting with audiences both in Australia and in our countries of origin. So New Zealand for Kim and Pakistan for me. So these are different strategies were basically how we amplify others rather than speak ourselves, but we use retweets and strategies like that. And then balancing banalities and events. So we focus more on what is happening, just sharing jokes and memes and what we did today, that kind of thing, but not really indulging in feelings as such. And then performing a nothing to see here self, which is like you kind of pretend that nothing really is much is happening. So we are just going to continue with sharing, just nothing, basically, some sharing things which are not necessarily, which are telling anyone anything about what we are feeling, how we are dealing with what's happening around us, and so forth. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Saira. We'll go next to Michael, if we can, please.
Hello from Colorado. My name is Mike Humphrey, and I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. And the paper that I'm presenting is kind of a reverse of, at least in our field, of the field of mass media, a reverse of the normal flow, whereas usually you would take a theorist and look at text. I'm taking text to look back at a theorist, Hannah Arendt and her concept of public and private, especially as she describes it in the book, The Human Condition. And I'm using the YouTube channel now called BritSpace, which was at one time a channel, a family vlog about a mixed race couple, and that has now become a vlog about a single Black woman raising 2 children. And that change gave me an opportunity to look at how Brit's persona particularly is spoken to in comments through the channel before and after her divorce, a divorce she did not choose. And to think about the role of persona there, because that is obviously the same human being, but the persona gets shifted quite drastically, especially early on in the change. Which made me wonder, how much control we have over these persona that we negotiate in that public space, and of course that idea of public and private through Arendt's concept is collapsed in modern times, and I think YouTube vlogs are a really great example of how that has happened. That collapse has become almost pure entertainment now, but Arendt had some very serious blind spots, and to examine those rather than examining through my own eyes, I decided to look through BritSpace, also with an interlocutor, so to speak, of a theorist named Gynes, who takes on Hannah Arendt's concept of race when it comes to this public-private space, and what the oikos, or the household, actually means both in ancient Greek times and through history after that, what it means to be private in those spaces, and who gets erased in those private spaces, and who gets to show up in public to do the world building that Arendt talks about. So it's it's really about Arendt at the end of the day, with Brit Space as a helpful lens.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. We'll go next to Jessica, if we can.
Hello from Berlin. It's nice to speak to you. So I focused my research on the arts. I myself studied art up until 2009, so I didn't have the issue of like social media and how do you present yourself. Back then it was more like, do I go into a gallery? Do I take my portfolio? Do I just show up? Or, you know, like, what can you do? What aren't you allowed to do? What are you supposed to do? And I realized quite fast nowadays you have online like quite a lot of possibilities on how to present yourself. But the question is, how do you present yourself correctly and who's your audience? So if I'm a street artist, I might want to have I don't know, 10,000 followers, 200,000 followers, because I'm interested in commercial collaboration. But if I'm an artist, a fine artist, I want to appeal to galleries or collectors. So it's very niche. So what I did for my paper, I interviewed fine artists who are I would say mid-career, maybe emerging, and I spoke to some galleries. And in the end, I wish I could have spoke to more, but with Corona, it was very tricky to be able to speak, and also not in person. I'm doing independent research. It was quite hard, but I found out that some interesting things as well about artists, that how they present themselves. They're very much caught up in the traditional view of like presenting a very clean, very clean, profile, I'd say, like more like a white cube. They're very careful also who to approach. And when I spoke to the galleries, on the other hand, they were wanting to speak to these artists. So they were researching these artists, but they also were open to connect to these artists. And if I go further into this persona studies research, I wish I would have a bit more seen it on a meta level, so compared it to other fields. But for now, I really got trapped in the rabbit hole and just saw these artists and what I can, maybe what advice I could give to them on how to best present themselves online.
Great, fabulous. Thank you, Jessica. And we'll finish up with Chris. And I'm going to pitch you the first question too, Chris, so just so you know.
Thanks, Kim. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Chris Moore. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, which is on the land of the Dharawal-speaking people. My paper is looking particularly at niche creator industries, which is a kind of band of content creators that kind of sit at a level of popularity that would sit just below what Cunningham and Craig call social media entertainers. So these are content creators across multiple platforms, but particularly social media, of course, whose audiences are in the hundreds and thousands, right? So these are, small scale creators who are nonetheless, able to earn a wage, a living off the content that they're producing. However, this is of course entirely precarious, and it's often offset by other types of labor. And so this is part of the issue that I'm interested in. And so my paper is looking specifically at the niche of the hobby industry, which is actually a very broad umbrella term for a range of occupations and interests and hobbies. My paper is going to be a book chapter, and it's looking at how these niche creator industries are able to drive diversity in areas where that might not have previously existed. And so I'm quite interested in the niche hobby industry, where women are entering the industry for the first time specifically through miniature painting side of the industry, as opposed to the more male-dominated tabletop war game side or the model train side. And we're also seeing a newer kind of emergence in women producing content around miniature dioramas. So these are very small, very niche, but nonetheless quite interesting content that's mostly available via Patreon, via Twitch, via YouTube. And, this is a question, I think, for the audience, but also for anyone else. If you have any recommendations for niches that I should check out, because I look at a certain type of content on YouTube, it doesn't show me content outside of the niche that I'm interested in. So I get a lot of, kind of philosophy, medieval weaponry. I went down the rabbit hole of terrarium niche creation. So if you have any recommendations for niches that I would not have normally think about, I would love that in the comments. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Chris. I know Holly Cruz is doing some work on hobby horse girls, which is a very interesting niche community. But they have an an in-person thing as well. I'm waiting for that chapter to come out because it just sounds so fascinating. It's so outside my kind of scope of understanding of the world as a kind of area of things that people do. So one of the things that really struck me in your presentation, Chris, was when you were talking about the future. And I know it's kind of weird to start this kind of panel by thinking about the future, but I think that that's actually an interesting place to start, because I think that there are one of the intersections between these different pieces collected here is the kind of facilitation of different platforms, different people, different, I guess, social media really broadly construed, and individuals who are making stuff that they love. So you talked about the idea of probable, possible, and preferable futures in terms of thinking about legislation, but I think it goes broader than that as well, for the niche creator persona. And I know one of the discussions that's happening at the moment in the UK is around legislation of the influencer industry, which is a step, I think, beyond where you are sitting, but it intersects here as well because of the relationship with Games World. So I guess what I'm working around to is how the kind of case studies that you were working with, how this kind of interacts in the focus between legislation, platform use, content creation and persona production. And I know there's a lot going on there, so you can just pick an angle and run with it, basically.
Thanks, Kim. So that futurological perspective comes from futurologist Wendell Bell, and a paper that he proposes this model for thinking about the future in a really practical way. And the first is the probable, so what's likely to occur. And then kind of the opposite end of that is, well, what's possible? What might occur given the current conditions that we're looking at? And then intersecting both of those poles is what we would prefer to happen. And so this creates a really nice kind of framework to think about any kind of topic that like this that we want to see happen. And so when it comes to legislation, I think the biggest one, of course, is intellectual property. And so in terms of what's probable, in terms of intellectual property, is that we are seeing the ever shrinking acceptability of what can be done with other people's intellectual property in terms of creating content online. This is quite interesting. So one of the case studies that I gave of a Games Workshop in the paper is that the niche creator industries are an enormous amount of freely provided labor and advertising for an intellectual property that is held in a publicly traded company. And just after I finished writing the book chapter, actually, that company announced a new app with a content layer that totally reproduces everything that all of the niche content creators do on YouTube. They've even hired some of the content creators to work in that app, but it's a closed infrastructure. You have to operate and live in that app if you want to produce in that app. You have to sign NDAs. You obviously can't be critical of the company. There's all this kind of terms and conditions and so that's the probable future, is this ever shrinking zone of what can be done with other people's intellectual property. In terms of what's possible, Again, you have to think in terms of constraints, right? So what's possible is constrained by the terms and conditions that the platforms that we operate on are limited by. You know, what's possible on Zoom is limited by the terms and conditions, YouTube, Facebook, so it's not only a precarious activity in terms of the labor and the return on investment of time, but your whole channel can be deleted in an instant. And we see this all the time. And you have no recourse. You have there's no arbitration system. There's no appeal to a higher authority in order to regain that. All that you can do is appeal to an audience. And we see that on YouTube all the time, where there was a Japanese content producer. She makes tiny little meals, like she makes tiny little sushi out of tiny little doll's house. Her channel was just obliterated. Millions of views on each of these, and so she had to make an appeal to the audience to get YouTube to notice that appeal in order to get that reinstated. In terms of what's preferable, so this is where I talk about the creative industries, and the creative industries as a doctrine, as an advocate for creators that needs to expand its remit beyond what we would understand as the traditional legacy media style content creator and the content publisher, to include fans and fan labor, as fans start to gain audiences and then move, through levels of popularity into social media entertainment. I think I answered your question somewhat.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. I think so. So I think it's interesting to think there about thinking about fans, and I'm going to do an awkward segue over to Mike, and that's because I think that there's one of the things that I was really drawn to in your presentation was this idea that a vlog that was about a family and then about a woman and her interactions with the world drew you into theory. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that particular case really caught you, either as a fan or as somebody who was just, how did you find and get engaged with that, and how did it then lead you into thinking differently about Hannah Arendt?
Yeah, it was part of a bigger project where I was looking at family vlogging as a part of a concept of imagined family. The audiences that sort of grow up around family vlogs tend to get really committed to both the family as a whole and as well as other fans within their purview and individuals within the family as well. And that's where Knive Nulls, which the original channel, really built up a large imagined family, primarily of people who could relate to the joys and the struggles that a family in America that has a white father and a black mother go through. And so a lot of that is about identification or curiosities and things like that. And I actually watched this happen in real time while I was studying them. The divorce happened, and much like the paper I wrote for Persona Studies in the past, I am just for some reason really drawn to collapses and what happens in digital space when a collapse occurs. And so that really drew my attention. Once the collapse had occurred, I really wanted to understand what that would mean. And one of the things that was most compelling about Brit's space when it became that is she was very transparent about the fact that this vlog was her main source of income and really, really important to the family now. And that means more views were necessary. She needed to keep up the number of video views to sustain her children and her life in this house in Kansas City, Missouri. And so watching that struggle was kind of the entry point. And then I started to notice the difference in the way their fan base was addressing her versus the way the Nivenals were being addressed. And that Arendt's a really interesting person to think about when you think about YouTube family vlogs, because of this distinction between public and private. So I already had Arendt in the mix. But I really started to question, would Brit be allowed into this sort of world-making public space? And at what point would she be allowed to be considered an equal voice, which is one of Arendt's concepts, is that great plurality is many different perspectives being treated on an equal plane in this negotiation of reality. And it started to occur to me that that's not the case. Around the exact same time, I heard about an article that Arendt had written around the same time she wrote The Human Condition, about integration of Little Rock, a school in the south of, which was still segregated, and which she criticizes Black parents for sending their children to white schools, and makes the claim that this in-between space of social, which is, what has created in modern times the space between public and private, and sort of like blurred the lines between public and private, is where a child's education is. It isn't a public concern. It's a private and a social concern, which was a very strange application of her own theory, which I had really been relying on. And so all that was kind of happening at the same time. And then when you made the call, Kim, to think about this, I immediately thought of that tension, which I hadn't really gotten to write about yet, and what it did to me personally, which is interesting because I know, I don't have an autoethnographic approach to this, but I really appreciated what you all did, and it sent me into a little bit of a crisis personally, because I was resting so heavily on Arendt, and one of Arendt's key extenders, Adriana Cavarero, which is sort of my philosophical hero. So I was just like, where do I fit in all this? What do I think about this? And what are the differences that a Black woman has to go through when we negotiate these things? And then, of course, the racial reckoning we've been dealing with in America intensified all those questions for me and made me look at them in even deeper and more meaningful ways and reflect on what it means to be my position, which is highly privileged. And I think all that together was what cooked this into an idea.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see the richness of the ways that we end up in the places that we are. I don't have a smooth segue this time, but I do want to think a little bit about labour, and I want to think about it in terms of the three other positions. So this does kind of tie in a little bit to the labour that Brit puts in to her work, and the way that she constructs that as income, and that's her job. It might be entertaining, but it's work. And think about it first for Jessica in terms of that interplay between the labour that the artists are doing on their own behalf, and then the way that the galleries see that as something that they can then kind of co-opt. I kind of got that sense from your presentation, that they expected to be able to use the personas that artists were building for themselves to kind of bump up their own gallery space. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it was interesting to see that, like, the galleries, they were looking for artists who would, of course, fulfill their expectations. They're not looking for numbers. I don't know if this is completely true, because of course, like, if you have somebody who has a follower of like 10,000, but I did believe them. They were very specific about what qualities an artist should bring, especially saying that the artist has to be authentic, so that when you meet the artist in person, you will actually get what you see online. And they were also very, they have to be able to work with the artists, and also the artist has to fulfill the repertoire that they expect for the whole gallery, so must fit into the program. So I, going back to your question, can you just say again what it was, just to
Yeah, no, I was just interested in that idea that, you know, when an artist is producing a persona, you can see it as a thing that everybody does all of the time now that we kind of don't think about as work. But also when it's building your professional persona, it does constitute a form of labor. And I was just interested to see if the galleries had reflected on the labor that the art. Sorry, I muted myself. If the galleries had reflected on the labor that the artists were putting in to build their own profiles, that then the gallery could, I guess, build off as well.
So yeah, they were very interested in working with artists who are versed in social media, because of course then there'll be much more communication. There's also Instagram takeovers become possible. So that was a very important fact, which you wouldn't really expect, I found. Not only because if the artist is online, he can actually be found, but also when you work with the artist, he can actually support the gallery. And not only by offering like insights into his studio and how he creates his work, even I found an interesting aspect was that as an artist, you usually don't show works in progress. It's like a no-go. It's another thing that you just don't do. And nowadays, it's something that the audience kind of expects. So the artists, the galleries who hire these artists are automatically offering their potential buyers glimpses into the work behind the scenes, which is something that used to be the case. You'd say like, oh, we have to set up a meeting between the artist and the gallery and the collector just to get this like kind of background perspective.
Great, thank you so much. So Travis, I guess to move to you, then thinking about the idea of labour and fan labour in particular, and how that worked here, because what we've got people who are deeply invested. We could see it as a fandom, but also that they're contributing to a persona that didn't otherwise exist, I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you wanted to kind of, I'll let you run with that.
Yeah, no, that's actually really interesting. I wouldn't say that Opportunity didn't have a persona prior to these postcards. For example, there was lots of social networks, including those managed by NASA itself. Interestingly, they seem to wipe those once the program kind of ends and they become archived. So that's an interesting thought in management of persona for these objects anyway. But yeah, it's absolutely a fandom. And although I haven't theorized it in that term, I've thought about it in that way quite a lot. The other interesting thing that it does is it generates the act of making the communication there. And the other thing about the postcards is that they're not signed. There's no names on them. So I find that to be the ones where people insert their names, quite often little astrological societies or astronautical societies or whatever they, different groups around the world, fans of space in a sense, insert their name as a group, and they've written the postcard as a group, but it's not signed by anybody. And so there's this real aspect of community making, but how do you make a community if everyone is not even individualized because they don't have an individual persona at all? It's just not attached there. I came back to a paper by David Paterno that was in Media International Australia a few years ago, and he examined graffiti on desks and furniture inside a college dorm space, and looked at how those pieces of furniture were transformed from media or from a technology into a medium for communication. And although this is a much more straightforward medium for communication, I think there's a lot of interesting parallels there around the way that people who are disconnected in space and time even form a kind of community through a common method of communication, in this case activated by this object, which is the Opportunity rover. I should apologize because I totally said 2014 before, and that cut a decade off the rover's lifespan. It was 2004, of course, which as soon as I said it, I went, that's too short. What am I talking about? But yeah.
It's all good. Okay, thank you so much. That's really interesting. So, Saira, to move to our work now. This isn't awkward at all. One of the things that we talked quite a lot about was what we didn't post, and this is something that will be more of a focus, I think, of the written version of this presentation. But that idea that there is, and it comes back to that idea of labor as well, of choosing when to not speak and what not to say. And I think this also ties in potentially to Mike's case study as well, in terms of what she didn't put forward, what she did. And so I thought perhaps I'd give you an opportunity to just speak briefly on that.
Yes, it was actually quite interesting once we started looking at what we don't say, which is very sort of present by not being there, you know, like it's one of those things. A lot of it, I think, comes from, some of it is conscious decisions, but then others are, I think, it's a moment and you're in it and you don't really think about it, but you post what you post. I think it's also a lot of times we use social media to get away from things. So that too kind of builds into, what we don't want to particularly face, what we are doing or have to live through. We don't want to now bring here and talk about it online. So there's a little bit of that, I think, but it is interesting that most of, at the initial stage right now, it kind of comes from a duty of care, if I could use that term. It's more about thinking about others. It's thinking about not making them feel bad, not, getting them worried. So presenting a picture of like, everything is good, and let's look at another joke while we're at it, kind of thing. And but just presenting a more positive side to everything. It's so I think it's just interesting how we may communicate over the phone or in different more sort of private communication forms. We might communicate a lot more, but on a public forum like Facebook, even when you have a private account, it still is more public. There we tend to sort of limit what we are willing to say in many ways. Yes.
Yeah. It was interesting as we were doing this project, because Saira and I we're both migrants. That's the point of this paper. And at a time when we were both, fairly furious on a lot of different levels with things that were happening around the world, we kind of elected not to say things about those things. And so there was that kind of political dimension of silencing ourselves, which has been researched in terms of identity and migrants and things. But then also the personal of not wanting to worry people back home, and then feeling, I don't want to use the word guilty, but lucky, I guess, and not wanting to, be visibly lucky. We'll just quietly sit here with our, relatively stable situation in the world. Great. Okay. So in terms of general questions, and I can see that everybody's doing lots of messaging backwards and forwards behind the scenes, and I might get you to some of that, speak to it so that it's on the record, because I think there's some interesting discussions happening here that the recording won't capture. But I did want to kind of open the floor a little bit and think about the role of platform. So we talk about a range of different platforms here, so websites, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and more broadly than that as well, in terms of where people are performing versions of themselves, of producing personas, maybe a single facet of a persona that's spread across multiple platforms, like Chris was talking about, that they have Twitter and YouTube and so on, or maybe it's a single platform, an artist who only has Instagram and kind of concentrates all of their energy there. And I wanted to kind of prompt a discussion around how different platform affordances and constraints allow us to do different things. So I'm going to open that up and just see if anybody wants to have a go. Just take yourself off mute and run with it, folks. Anybody at all?
I thought Michael was reaching for the mute button then, so I was going to let him have it. But platform affordances are really interesting, but I think they're most interesting, and this perhaps goes to some of what we have been having in the back channel, where they help to create social connections between people. They of course are mediators in that relationship as well, and they shape and control that. This is coming back to actor network theory, right? Actor network theory would describe that relationship between the agents, all the actors, as more or less equal in some regard. But I still tend to think that these things are only really useful for the way that they help us relate to each other, or things that matter to us in the world. And that may be the world itself, right? It may be, in the case of my work, Mars. It may be space. It doesn't have to be a person, but the mediators there, and the way that they're governed and the way that they're structured and controlled. You know, I tried to get in touch with NASA 6 times over the last 5 years to try and get this data in a more clean way than screenshots, but also because I wanted to ask them questions about the level of moderation that had gone into it, whether there was automated moderation or somebody was behind the scenes booting out particular postcards. And so those questions are quite often open, right? We don't know how much moderation goes on into these platforms sometimes, and therefore how much interference there is between the social connections that are being made.
Great, thanks.
And just jumping off from that a little bit, from the human use of them, what we can see of that anyway. I think there is, in YouTube especially, which I've spent a lot of time looking at, is both, I mean, obviously the affordance itself of building these audiences, but there's a lot of affordances built into pressuring the narrative of the video itself, and that comes with the ability to rank or to express something back. And there was a question in the chat about the archives in YouTube, which are never truly archived unless a video goes away, so the memories of the past life can continue to be recapitulated within those videos, and what the video means changes based on those interactions, because they're bringing the future into the past and recontextualizing everything the father does, sometimes in judgment, sometimes in nostalgia. But I think that affordance to continue to reconsider what the video means puts a lot of pressure on the narrative that the channel is trying to create in general. And of course, in some ways that's very good, and because it sort of puts pressure on the perfection model. That's a big part of YouTube. But in another way, at times it's made me very sad that, a video that could stand on its own, like I think about the children a lot who are mediated in these spaces, videos that could stand as some good moment in their lives get recontextualized by people who are bringing what's happened since back into these spaces. And they're so close together that I really do think that they actually have an effect on the narrative that the video itself in the video well is trying to convey. And I think that makes for a very complicated space, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about archives, and Jessica, I'm going to prompt you here to think about the Instagram and the kind of the archive of images that goes back. So presenting a professional artist persona, you want to keep that length, right? You want to have depth to your to your archive in Instagram, but equally perhaps your style changes or something happens or you want to show development. Did the artists that you spoke to talk about that at all in terms of their relationships with the way that they're presenting themselves? Do they ever regret things or delete things or you know, that kind of engagement?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I was also thinking about what Mike was saying now. The whole Instagram definitely functions as a kind of portfolio, like a digital portfolio. And when you scroll down, you can see at the beginning that the artists show more of their private lives. So you see pictures of them with their friends. And gradually, there's this artist I spoke to just before my project. You could really see the difference. Gradually, those pictures, they're not deleted, so you can still see them, but they just become less and less. So whereas you had like scenes of them maybe, I don't know, going out with their friends, in the end it would be them sitting in their studio presenting their work. And when I spoke to some of the artists as well about whether they delete posts, it was interesting that some artists will first of all think a long time before they post something, so that actually it's not like a quick, oh, like let's take a picture of this and upload it quickly. They're actually thinking about what they're presenting online. And there were some who, out of fear of reaction, would then take the post down again. Like if it was an artwork that wasn't finished yet and they were like, oh, well, maybe it's not such a good moment to share this now, they would have posted it and then take it down. Or they clean that's what they said, they clean their feed. So they'll go back and say like, oh, this, I don't like this image, or it doesn't match my portfolio, I've changed the direction, and they'll take out old feed and clean these. And about presenting themselves, it was interesting, they all had a problem with it. So they don't really like presenting themselves, they just feel it's something that they have to do because the audience wants to see it.
It's become a bit of a trend to pick up on that in particularly for musicians, I think, to kind of wipe their social feeds clean ahead of the one I'm thinking about is Taylor Swift, right? You wipe the social feeds clean before releasing a new album, and then everything becomes about that album and that identity. And so, yeah, there's an interesting, maybe it's a sort of trend that other artists, even in different mediums and obviously different levels of achievement, are picking up on this kind of everything's about the current work and the rest of it is past.
So that's interesting, because fans then look for that, right? They're like, hey, Beyonce's deleted all their content, there must be something coming soon, right? But then also that does allow you to change and grow. And we've been hammered for so long that what's on the internet is on the internet forever, and all of that stuff, which then kind of constrains performances a little bit. Be interesting if somebody wanted to do some work on the relationship between that and some more of the intentionally ephemeral platforms like Snapchat, where things are supposed to disappear, right? Yeah,
one of our attendees has pointed out, Janie, that it's just something that brands are adopting as well more broadly. So yeah, but ephemerality is interesting, right? Because Twitter itself is sort of supposed to be ephemeral, but there's nothing preventing you going back and looking at the full archive, right? It doesn't actually delete.
No, that was terrifying. As somebody who's just downloaded her own whole archive, it is.
And look, they make it really hard, right? They deliberately make it extremely hard to delete your tweets.
Yeah, absolutely. So another kind of or an area, I guess, that we can finish up on. We're at about 50 minutes at this point, so we'll use this as the kind of wrap up discussion, and hopefully everybody can have a go at it. So thinking about what you have presented here, what do you think, either for you or for somebody else, knowing that we can't do all of the things, what's the next thing that you see this research is kind of pushing towards? So where do you see this, what you've kind of put forward here today, or as part of this conference, how does this extend forwards? And Jessica, I'm going to start with you because you have a very easy answer to that. Once the border to Australia opens.
Exactly, I'll be researching that more. I definitely found a very interesting aspect would be which audience you're addressing. Like if you're online, is it global, is it local? Because I ran into that kind of problem also just with the language. Everybody speaks English, so who are you trying to reach? And then if I'd actually I found my research very niche, and I definitely got, like carried away with speaking to artists. I'd like to lift it onto another level and maybe compare it to other fields like the music industry, and then see how you can maybe approach this better. So I think to find out what the persona, what does he need to know to be successful? So, and how will he go about doing that? Because me approaching galleries with a background of research was so much easier than artists saying, what do you want to see? So I think, and there again, you run into these problems of like, who will take up on your contact, who will answer you? Again, art is very, very much dominated by connections. You have to know the right people, otherwise you don't get these answers. So I think all these fields, especially now with the music industry, or they could be, if there would be studies on each level, and then you could take comparisons and find the best way for these personas to find out what is actually needed. That would be really interesting research.
Yes, wonderful. I love that you're operationalizing it. It's something that we've talked about a lot, and I think don't do as well as we should in terms of we find out all these wonderful, interesting things. I think that goes for academia as a whole, actually. So yes, thank you very much, Jessica, and we're really hopeful that you'll be able to get to Australia, because we have University of Adelaide has a scholarship waiting for Jessica as soon as the borders open to come here and do this work. So we're desperate for that to happen. So Saira, do you want to go next and talk about the next steps in terms of the migration research?
Yes, so we have been planning to, start with ourselves, but then also look at migrant personas generally. And we are, we would be looking into something like how, first of all, like, going back to the affordances and constraints of different platforms and how they actually enable different types of personas to be created, and how much of a part do they play into that strategy as a whole, and then also looking at how these personas are perhaps different for different migrants from different parts of the world. We in our mini reflection that we've just done, work to be continued, but we discovered a few differences and similarities already. So it would be interesting to see that on a broader level as well.
Great, thank you. Travis, are you going somewhere with this stuff? I know you've been thinking about this for so long. You must have something more.
Yeah, so to let people in on the joke, I think Chris and Kim know that I've been working on this particular paper before Opportunity ceased operating. I think back in for at least 5 or 6 years. It's been quite a while. I see in terms of persona studies, I found this, finally getting this one together, I found it as a really interesting look at the collections, and I pitched it into this conference as a look at the way that persona is formed in a collective sense. And I especially was interested because, as I say, the robot doesn't have a strong pre-existing persona that's controlled by somebody else. It's not a celebrity who has at least some control over how they're presented. That there isn't there certainly are presentations of it, of the robot, and people have always attached to it, and it's not just this one, you know, all of the rovers, and they're all tied up with political, long-standing political views and movements as well, you know, going back to the start of the space race in the Cold War. So that's all really interesting. And in terms of persona studies, I think there's a real opportunity to look at objects having persona that are collectively created in that way. In terms of my work and my research, I see this particular initiative as part of something broader that I'm continuing to look at with space technologies and space agencies as well, and the ways that they do communicate with the public. So I've got some work looking at NASA's live broadcasting of spaceflight activities, again, going back to the 60s and into now, where it's essentially all live streamed over the internet, and the commercial operators, the commercial spaceflight companies have really taken that up as well. So yeah, there's lots that I want to continue to do with this. I also, again, back to the 60s, I keep framing things in Marshall McLuhan's terms as media being the extensions of man. I put a blog post out maybe 4 years ago where I said, what are our rovers, probes, satellites, and telescopes, if not extensions of our own human presence and faculties? And so a term that I developed in my PhD looked at media as sensory prostheses, and these devices, again, something I put in the chat to the other panelists, are our way of having a universe, of experience in the universe, because we can't get there ourselves. And so I think that's really interesting. For me, there's also a project around claiming space from the STEM people.
That would be fabulous. And there's one of the few space people that I follow on Twitter actually is Dr. Space Junk, Alice Gorman, who's a space archaeologist. She's fabulous.
I have a book here right next to me. It's
nice.
It's well thumbed.
So the other thing that I think is really valuable there is that a lot of the work that Chris and David and Katja and I have done has been really focused on agency in persona building. And by looking at non-human collectively constructed persona, you're almost removing that agency element from the persona itself. And I think that's so intriguing. It does such interesting things to our conceptualizations of what it means to have an identity.
Yeah, and Chris really challenged me on this a few years ago. You know, he said it's not just about. I went back through our old Twitter chats. He said it's not just about anthropomorphization. Like, it can't just be that, because that's still centrally controlled. And then yeah, finally I kind of worked it out.
Great. So Mike or Chris, I'm unfazed as to who goes next. Where are you going from? Where are you going next, either of you? I should have nominated. Sorry.
You should have. Thanks, Kim. What I'm interested in, particularly when it comes to niche creators, is really care and protection and mental health. One of the things that Saira was talking about was posting on social media in a way that cares for others, and I was really intrigued by that. And I think Michael's paper particularly talks about the consequences of the industrialization of these platforms, and the way that these platforms turn the personal, turn the household, right, the oikos, into content, and the kinds of obligations that come in terms of the need to drive content, to produce content at a certain time in a certain way, then that is enrolled in the expectations of the audience, and how this industrialization turns passions and interests and personal lives into content streams, and what the emotional and psychological and mental health consequences are of that for content creators trying to thrive in this situation. And so I'm hoping, I lost my sabbatical, so I'm hoping I can claim that back somehow and go out and actually interview content creators about some of the strategies that they use you know, particularly because, you know, we see, you know, with miniature painting, right, that is often used as a way to recapture mental health, right? It's therapeutic, it's relaxing. Knitting, crocheting, all these sorts of arts and crafts are a really fundamental part of a mental health recovery for many people. And so I'm interested to see how they think about that as content, and what strategies they are employing in order to do that, and then the responsibilities of like the creative industries, and how we protect that space and how we protect people's mental health working in these precarious industries.
Fabulous. Mike.
Well, I just would like to express appreciation that you left it to the bald community to wrap this up. So that's really, I feel seen in that way. And really, you know, I think I totally agree with what Chris just said. I think that those are really, really important questions for the creator communities across digital space. And the other question I have, and I really actually thought a lot about this with your and Saira's presentation, a lot of Arendtian thought focuses on who gets to appear and what it means to appear in public space. But I think one of the things you both talked about negotiating are the chances to disappear. And I think that's a really important thing to think about as a privilege, you know, and that also includes when you get to choose to be silent. And, you know, I know, like, for a lot of people who feel like lives are on the line, that pressure to appear becomes even greater in times like the ones we are living in now. But also when you think about who got to disappear and who got to appear during the pandemic and the shutdowns, the lockdowns, you know, there was privilege even in that, being able to disappear. And as these technologies become more pervasive and become more part of the offline world, and those things merge together, I think the ability to disappear is going to become a really important privilege to carry around. And how is that distributed in a just way, I think, is a really important question we could be studying. And migration is a great way to think about that, you know, both because, like, and, you know, here in the United States, a really important an important part of the southern border migration story are called testimonios on YouTube. And those are really self-exposing videos that are done with the hope that it will create new empathies and maybe change the discourse a little bit about what it means to migrate here. And but that's asking a lot of a human being to expose themselves. And so, you know, how does that get distributed in ways that's more equal? I think is a good ethical question to be asking as these technologies get more critical in our lives.
Fabulous. To finish thinking about ethics and our responsibilities and these is just a fabulous way to end. And I think overall we've had some really engaging conversation, and I'm really grateful for everybody for making the time to speak and to listen and learn, and it's been wonderful. Thank you everybody, and thank you to our attendees in the background. I see you there. And we will take a breath. Next week we are looking at personas. Which one is that one? Goodness, you would think I would know this absolutely off by heart by now. But David Marshall is chairing that session. That's why it's not top of my mind. And you will have either a panelist link or a registered attendee link to come along to that one. It's at a slightly more friendly time for those of you in North America and Europe, and a significantly less friendly time in Australia, but we will deal with that. Thank you, Caitlin, for pointing out its personas in the embodied spaces panel. And this one also includes the data-driven marketing personas papers, which I think are a fascinating component of the work that we've engaged with here, that goes beyond a lot of the work that you know, a lot of us have done. So it's wonderful to have those contributions as well. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to wrap this up now. We will let Michael get to bed, Jessica to get to work, and the rest of us to continue on our afternoon. So thank you so much once again, and we will see you in a week's time. Thanks, folks.